how is the landscape and the protection different now from what we saw in Katrina?
Michelle, back in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit, there wasn't any preparation. The city will admit that, the state will admit that. But after a decade and a half and billions of dollars in infrastructure changes, they've made those levees stronger. The problem, though, if indeed there is a large storm surge and lots of heavy rains and flooding during Ida, New Orleans is at or below sea level. So even with reconstructed and fortified levees, New Orleans is basically a soup bowl. So if that water gets into the city, then basically you have standing water, flooding water, storm surge. So again, the city is prepared in terms of, yes, the infrastructure is stronger, but as you know, with Mother Nature, if indeed there are heavy rains and lots of storm surge, that could change the landscape of how the city is actually protected from a storm like Ida.
Okay, so the memories of Katrina there are so deep, not only in the minds of people who lost family members, who survived it, who watched these pictures destroying their region on television, even if they evacuated. To hear the strength of this storm now will likely be even worse than Hurricane Katrina. Because remember, Katrina made landfall as a Category 3. This could make landfall as a Category 4. The feeling there must just be terror.
It's frightening. I mean, think about that. As you mentioned, if Katrina landed as a Category 3 and caused that amount of damage, 1,800 deaths and $125 billion in damage, think about a Category 4 landing. Right now, Ida is at 150 miles an hour sustained winds. A Category 5 hurricane is 157 miles per hour sustained winds. So we're talking about battering, deadly, devastating winds, not to mention all the aftermath of what comes with a hurricane, as we've talked about the storm surges, which would go in 30, 40 miles. In fact, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which is about 85 miles northwest of New Orleans, they're preparing for the heavy rains, for the possible flooding. So when you talk about those sorts of situations with the wind damage, with the flooding, with the storm surge, then you add on to that the power outages, potential tornadoes, and then having people displaced from their homes, there is a lot of worry, a lot of fear, and hopefully this won't be a Katrina, but as with hurricanes, they're unpredictable. So the city and the state are preparing as best they possibly can.
From what we're hearing from U.S. officials right now, even with the wind speeds and the amount of rainfall that is predicted, likely because the storm surge could be smaller than what we saw in Katrina and the improvements that were made to infrastructure, they don't expect the water to breach levees this time around, which of course is good news. But when you look at the people still living there and you remember so well the destruction from not very long ago from that prior storm, Katrina, you have to ask the question, why still live there? I mean, this is a vulnerable area. We've been talking about it's at or below sea level. And there was a chunk of the population that did leave after Katrina, didn't it? But is there growth in other areas still along that coastline?
I don't know if you'd call it growth in those areas, but yes, after Katrina, about 150,000 of those residents came to the Houston area where I live, and other people went to Baton Rouge a little further north. Some went to Mississippi and Alabama, even Atlanta, Georgia. But in terms of people living there, I think it's a culture. I think it is that's something that's in you. And there was a sense of pride even when I lived in New Orleans. I went to school at Tulane University in New Orleans, and they went through a storm. There's a sense of pride that I can survive this storm. I can ride out this storm. But as we know, when hurricanes become deadly and people lose their homes, we're talking hundreds of thousands of homes lost in Katrina. Yes, many people did leave, but many people are staying. But with that staying in that area where you're prone to flooding and you're prone to hurricanes hitting, then you also run the risk of running into those disastrous situations of losing your home, possibly losing your life, not having the safety that you would have if you're further north or further inland. So yes, I think it's a double-edged sword. There are people who leave because they're scared, but there's people who stay because they're like, this is my home, this is all I've known, this is my family history. But again, they run the risks when a storm like Ida is barreling towards them at just about 100 miles south of New Orleans right now. True,
and it's estimated that the total damage from Hurricane Katrina was more than $150 billion. That includes the hit that the economy took. So now you have the people who stayed there. They see this even bigger storm barreling towards them, but it strengthened quickly, so they didn't have a lot of time to leave. How well did this area do with evacuations this time around?
I don't know if there's a scale that you can say how well is a place prepared, but Category 2 was where Ida was 24 hours ago, and it steadily increased rapidly to Category 4 within 24 hours. So being personally living along a coastline along the Gulf where hurricanes happen, when you have a Category 1 or Category 2, there is a sense of complacency, a lackadaisical approach of, yeah, we'll go to the grocery store, we'll get our supplies for hurricane and we'll ride out the storm. But when it jumps to a Category 4 and possibly a Category 5, then it's too late. And even the city has admitted they weren't ready for the contraflow traffic, which is when they take the highways and make them one way out as an exit. The city of New Orleans was not prepared. The state of Louisiana was not prepared. So there were mandatory evacuations along the coastline in Mississippi and Louisiana, but the voluntary evacuations are now in place because they couldn't get that contraflow in time to get people out of the city and out of that region along the Gulf in a rapid fashion. So yes, I think there's a sense of right now, everyone who's getting out that possibly can is doing so, but many people are going to have to batten down the hatches, stay where they are, shelter in place, and hope that Ida is not as bad as Katrina was back in 2005.
Exactly. As you know well, and as I know well too, when you're in a hurricane zone and you wait too long to make preparations, there is a point at which you're pretty much stuck. There's not much more you can do. So let's see what happens here. Darren, thank you for bringing us that.